Hello and welcome. This lesson intends to provide a broad overview of Thomas Szasz's argument on mental illnesses. First of all, a word of caution. This is not a conventional research study as we understand in our normal A-level psychology. It does not have conventional IV, DV, procedure, research finding, conclusion, etc. This is an essay. It is an essay about mental illnesses based on a set of conceptual, rational and moral arguments. So, if you are looking for a structure like Loftus and Palmer or Bandura or Milgram, you will be disappointed. Szasz did not carry out any study, as he admits in his paper that this is not an empirical research paper, but an argument for a case against psychiatry. Thomas Szasz was born in Hungary but spent most of his time in America. He started his career as a psychiatrist and psychoanalyst and very quickly realized that most of the concepts and systems in psychiatric system are deeply faulty. He therefore started his arguments against psychiatry. He wrote his first essay in 1960, which became quite famous, was titled as The Myth of Mental Illness. His primary aim was to vehemently challenge the medical character of the concept of mental illness. He was trying to reject the moral legitimacy of forcing people to treatment against their will. Now, in order to understand Szasz, we need to talk about psychiatry and anti-psychiatry movement as well. Another key player in this movement was Lang, who also had very strong views against the forced medical treatment for mentally ill patients. Before we go into the detail of Szasz's observation about psychiatry, we need to understand how psychiatric diagnostics work. Most of the psychiatric diagnosis relies on a diagnostic system called DSM, and DSM is a categorization system. In other words, DSM is a book of mental illnesses, which has got various categories of mental illnesses and contains their symptoms and indicators. Now, if you don't know how DSM is created, you need to know this. Most of this disorder listed in DSM has been listed by the process of voting. So a group of psychiatrists decide whether homosexuality would be a disease in the DSM X or it will not be. Nobody needs any explanation that voting is primarily a social process or a political process and remotely scientific in nature. So therefore, loads of mental illnesses constantly comes into the DSM and goes out of the DSM as more or less like top of the pop chart kind of a phenomenon. It is feared that many of them are included with unscientific bias that psychiatrists have. In other words, mental illnesses are a set of constructed categories agreed by psychiatrists. And the irony is that the millions of people will be labeled with mental illnesses using these categories. They will be hospitalized. They can find themselves isolated and confined. They can find taking highly potent psychotropic drugs, and in some rare cases may be given electric shock on the basis of these invented categories. Szasz argues that mental illnesses in fact don't exist. They are manufactured construct by psychiatrists. He argues that we often, for different reasons, behave in a deviant manner, which is indicative of person's suffering and sometimes could be disturbing to other people. So a particular person's behavior might be uncomfortable to other people. However, this is not an argument for calling somebody mentally ill. Szasz argues 50 years ago, the question, what is mental illness, was of interest to physicians, philosophers, sociologists, as well as the general public. Today, this is not the case. the question has been settled by holders of political power. In 1999, US President Bill Clinton declared, mental illnesses can be accurately diagnosed, successfully treated just as physical illnesses. The Surgeon General of America agreed by stating, just as things go wrong with our heart, kidneys and liver, so things go wrong in the brain. Thus, political power and professional self-interest united in turning a false belief into a lying fact. Szasz further argues that mental illnesses are inappropriate metaphor. Schizophrenia is not like cancer. One cannot use the metaphor of cancer or any other physical disorder to legitimize a mental disorder like schizophrenia. Physical illnesses are something that people have. Unfortunately, mental illnesses are defined by some things that people do. And unfortunately again, the judgment that this doing is not within the norm or normal is by another human being called psychiatrist in his or her subjective assessment. The proposition that mental illness is not a medical problem runs counter to the public opinion and psychiatric dogma. When you ask somebody that mental illnesses don't exist, you may find people saying, oh, I know somebody who has been diagnosed with mental illness and it later on found that he had a brain tumor. It is true that possibly as the time goes by and medical technology gets more sophisticated, we might find something that is deficient, dysfunctional or wrong in an organ called brain. This does not take away Szasz's argument that mental illness is a metaphor. It actually supports that viewpoint, because the physician who concluded the person had a mental illness and in fact had a brain tumor is basically has misdiagnosed a physical disorder, a brain tumor, and the person didn't have schizophrenia in the first place. So he had an undiagnosed bodily illnesses. Like Lang, Szasz believes that our behavior often deviates because of plethora of pressure that we sustain in our society. They are problems of living. They are problems of living in a complex, brutal, ruthless society. And when people suffer from this pressure and cannot cope, they cannot be classified as mental illnesses. We have already discussed lack of scientific evidence in deciding psychiatric illnesses. We know physical illnesses are discovered in laboratories under microscope or other scientific processes. Unfortunately, mental illnesses are discovered in a voting room of psychiatrists deciding DSM listing. Irony is, despite this lack of science, psychiatrists are not at all hesitant in giving people level of mental illness, not hesitant in hospitalizing people against their will, not hesitant prescribing them psychotropic drugs like Prozac, sometimes confining and isolating mental patient, and sometimes and many a times taking away their individual rights to decide many things in life. Now there is a difference between actually labeling people, giving them medicine, forcing them to treatment that is not foolproof, and actually trying to help people to cope up with their problems of living. Szasz further argues that psychiatric diagnosis is not about science, it is about power. In order to understand this, let me give you a very simple example that highlights the point. When you have a fight with another person and you get angry on the other person and want to dominate the other person, you may often use the sentences like, you are mad, you are paranoid, you are mental, in order to establish our control over the other person, suggesting the other person is less of a human being and is not a full functioning human being. Now, have you heard ever in your fight telling people, "Oh God, you have got diabetes. Oh God, you are cancerous," and so on? We don't do that with physical illnesses because that is something people has and can be verified and does not have any power connotation. Historically, in medieval times, occult practitioner, witchcrafts, religion provided such leveling, and only difference in modern times, psychiatrists have taken their places. Szasz feels 50 years later, very little has changed. 50 years ago, only psychiatrists were probably labeling and using this level. Today, state, political establishment, and partially legal community, knowingly or unknowingly, have become accomplished to this process. Therefore, mental illness is not an illness. It's a political legal categorization of people. Therefore, Szasz argues leveling, controlling, isolating, confining, drugging, and eventually taking individuals' rights in the name of so-called psychiatric diagnostic categories is morally, intellectually, empirically, and conceptually a fraud. And unfortunately, the political establishment state is part of it. Thank you.